Okay, let's take a look at our little clavicles problem and see how we can solve it. So when we were looking at our test animation here, there's two things that I noticed. The first one is that as the torso rotates side to side, you can see that the IK clavicle controls are not following that rotation. They're just staying vertical, which will probably make animation quite a bit harder. So we're going to look at that. And the second problem is more obvious when the character is in this pose, which is this really odd twisting of the muscle right here. And as we've looked at it, it turns out that there's something here in the clavicle not following the rotation of the rest of the torso. So let's take a look at that. And I'm gonna start by just fixing these guys. So let's see what these guys are doing. I'm gonna find this guy here in the rig, and we can see that its parent is right there, which is this locator right there, and it has a position constraint applied onto something. Let's see what that is. And it's position constrained onto two objects, this one right here and another hidden object, which is part of the arm. So that's what we have. Let's see if we can find this guy in our clavicle rigging workspace. Let's make this a little bit bigger, and there he is right there. So yeah, here's the position constraint, and he's constrained between these two objects, the clavicle reference and the upper arm, which is the this FK control. But I don't want this guy to be following the rotations of this FK control all the time, because that's going to be very unnecessary. I just want him to follow the torso rotations, and it looks like this guy does a pretty good job at that by himself. So all I'm going to do is, right now, the clavicle parent is not following because there's nothing controlling its rotations. I'm going to control its rotations using the same object. And that's going to be actually very easy. Let's first expose the inputs for the constraint. We're going to find that object right there. So you can see we get the clavicle pose reference item that we're interested in. And again, this FK control, which we're not interested in, so I'm just going to hide it again. This is the one we're going to keep. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to wire their rotations together. But I'm going to wire the world rotations, because that's going to be a much better idea than just trying to wire channels. So I'm going to add the world rotation channel to this object, and I'm going to add it to this object too. And I'm just going to wire them together. And now, as our friend tilts, you can see over here that that object is following, I mean the item, the IK control, as he bends and everything. So that's going to make animation a lot easier, because you're always going to be animating on its local axis correctly. And we have to do the same for this friend over here. So let's select its parent. There he is. Let's add the world rotation channel, and let's expose the inputs of its position constraint. Again, hide the FK control, add the world rotation channel to this other item that is one we're going to be using, and just wire them together. And he gets corrected, as you can see. So problem number 1 is solved. Now let's go and look at problem number 2. And to do that, we have to find the hierarchy for the deforming clavicles. Let's find that object right there. Here it is. I just selected the large joint right there, and I went and found it in the hierarchy. So let's see what's going on. So this guy is part of the auto clavicle hierarchy, which is part of the manual clavicle hierarchy, which is the topmost item in the clavicle hierarchy for this side of the character. So I'm gonna turn on the move manipulator just to have a visual reference of what this guy is doing as the torso rotates. So you can see that the z-axis is pointing down, the x-axis is pointing along the length of the joint, and the y-axis is pointing towards the back. So let's see what happens as the character moves forward. We can see that this guy is following the rotation pretty well. So the z-axis is still pointing this way. So it's rotating fine. So let's go to the next object in the hierarchy, this constraint IK clavicle aim, which is also pointing down on Z. And as the character rotates, it's still pointing vertically down on Z, which is definitely not what we want. So this is very likely the culprit of our problems. So let's see what he's doing. There's a channel modifier connected right there. I'm gonna go back to frame 0. And it's a direction constraint. Okay, that is pointing towards probably some locator here. Right there. He's pointing towards this guy. So this is part of the clavicle rig, but the problem with the clavicle not following the rotations is basically because this constraint doesn't have an up vector. So it's always pointing its up vector towards the y-axis in world space. So that's why it stays pointing up. So what we're going to do is give the constraint an actual up vector that it can use to define which way is up, and this up vector is going to move with the torso. So let's do that. I'm going to create a locator, and I'm going to make it part of the same hierarchy here, manual clavicle. And I'm going to set my drop action to match, and we're going to match it to this item right here. So let's get close. As you can see, is this one right there. So let's drag and drop our new locator there. Perfect. Let's change its display. I always use pyramids for my up vectors. Feel free to use any shape you want. I just identify them visually more easily using this pyramid, and I'm going to point it on the y-axis, because the up vector is always going to be defined by the y-axis of the locator. And let's move it towards the back of the character. Right there. Okay. A little bit further back, just to make it easy to see. And we're going to also give it a different color. Let's see. Something like a dark green. There you go. That reads well. Perfect. So now we have our up vector. Okay, and let's rename it since we're at it. So it's going to be called up vector. This is the right side clavicle. There we go. Cool. So now let's go and select again our clavicle constraint object. Let's check the properties of the constraint. So I'm going to go into setup mode, and I'm going to shift select. You have to select the constraint first, then shift select the up vector we just created, and in the direction constraint properties you can click on assign up vector, or from the modifiers tab you can use the same button. So let's say assign up vector, and oh, something shifted here. So I'll do that. I'll do it again so you can see it. There's something rotating right there, which is the actual constraint object. And the problem we have is that there's some offsets stored as part of the constraint. And as you can see, actually, a lot of the settings on the constraint make little sense. We have, for example, the axis of the constraint is the z-axis, whereas clearly it's the x-axis that is running down the length of the joint, and it's the x-axis that is pointing towards the target of the constraint. So why do we have this? Well, it is very likely that we constrained this item using compensation. So basically that created a constraint where the object retained its original orientation, which we actually needed, but then we didn't change any of the other settings to make this constraint be, well, have settings that we can actually correlate to what we see in the viewport. So now that we're adding an up vector, that's becoming a problem. So what we're going to do is correct these settings to make the constraint work for the actual orientation of the constrained object. And that's going to be very easy, because now that we have this up vector to use as sort of like an orientation anchor, we can just basically correct here our settings. So we're going to set the axis to the x-axis, which is going to be running down the length of the joint. And we're going to get rid of all the offsets. And as you can see, everything goes back to normal. Looks perfect. That's great. So let's see what happens if we go out of setup mode and we scrub through our little test animation. That looks okay. That looks okay. This looks fine. Bending. Let's go to the pose where we can really notice a problem. And as you can see over here, I'm gonna turn off overlay drawing just for a second. Over here, that ugly bump that we had is gone, whereas over here we still have it because we haven't fixed it for this other clavicle. So the difference is very obvious immediately. So this clavicle is now working properly because our up vector over here is moving with the entire setup. So our clavicle keeps its local orientation perfectly at all times. So what remains is we now have to do the same setup, but for the other clavicle, which should be fairly straightforward. We've already done it for one. So let's do it very quickly for the other clavicle. Let's go and find the clavicle on the other side of the character, right there. I'm going to collapse this one. We don't need it anymore. We're going to create a locator. We're going to make it part of the manual clavicle group locator. Let's call it up vector left side clavicle. And we are going to match it onto this item. So let's find this item right there. Here it is. Let's drag and drop our new locator there. And same thing, let's make it into a little pyramid. And on the y-axis, and let's move it. Now, here's an interesting thing. As you can see, the position, if I move this on the positive direction of the y-axis, this locator ends up in a totally different place than the previous one. Why is that? Well, that's basically because, if you remember, we set up our clavicles using a sort of a mirrored setup, whereas the rotations of one are mirrored in relation to the rotations of the other side. And this allows us to take, for example, both of these controls and take our rotate tool, and we're in local mode, and if I engage rotations like this, I can mirror the animation on both sides, which is pretty handy for animation purposes, but it results in this funky side effect of sometimes things being on what it doesn't appear to be a symmetrical position in relation to items on the other side. But in this case, we really don't care. What this needs to do is to work, not to look nice. So let's again color our locator. There we go. So now we're going to go into this item, go into setup mode, and we're going to do exactly the same. As you can see, we have the same case over here where we have some values that are stored because of the compensation mode. But we're going to take this and direction constrained. assign up vector. Again, there is a flip. Let's correct this. X-axis 0 everywhere. But because the x-axis of this side is running in the opposite direction, we have to turn on negative axis. And now everything looks perfectly well. Because if you examine this item correctly, you will see that the x-axis is not running down the length of the joint, it's going in the opposite direction. So that's why we're using this negative axis option. And now everything is fixed. So there you are. Let's hide the arm. Let's scrub our animation again. Everything looks okay. Perfect. Good. Great. The clavicle's problem is gone. And our deformations are looking pretty good so far. As you can see, we also have some clavicle animation right there, which looks good. And of course, I still have control of my IK clavicles. So yeah, I would say that overall, we are headed in a pretty good direction right now. So with our clavicles fixed, we can proceed to the next step of working on the deformations for this superhero. So let's keep on going.